The Honourable Scott Simpson.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I've been sitting listening carefully to contributions from members on the other side of the House, and I have to say that the debate has been more measured than I perhaps thought it would be earlier on. And I particularly wanted to comment on several of the contributions from Green Party members who I think, particularly Catherine Delahunty, made a very good historic analysis of the dilemmas and situations that we find ourselves in. Now, I'm not one that normally agrees with much of what Catherine Delahunty has to say, but I thought her contribution in this debate was actually very thoughtful and useful. Members have made a number of points in various speeches about ownership of the land. And clearly some of them have not even read the explanatory note in the second paragraph, which makes it very clear that the development land is Crown owned. This is land that Minister Smith, in an earlier contribution in this debate earlier this afternoon, made very clear, land that has been funded and purchased by taxpayers and as such is entirely appropriately available for housing, for treaty settlement issues and for the purposes of this bill. What I have found particularly unusual is that not too many months ago in this very House, Labor members supported the Riccarton Racecourse legislation, which was a reserve piece of land for exactly the same type of purposes as being explored by this piece of legislation, and now on this piece of legislation they simply don't. And what I'm keen to know is what's changed. What is it in amongst the Labor Party that's changed from their support for the Riccarton Racecourse legislation that now they find themselves unable to support this legislation, which seeks to achieve very similar objectives and goals? Phil Twyford, in his contribution, made the point that actually Labor have no beef with Ngāti Paua. But then he went on to say that it was important that governments govern in the interests of all New Zealanders, which is exactly what this bill seeks to achieve, not for any other reason than that. Ngāti Paua came to the Minister, Nick Smith, seeking this opportunity, and they didn't actually want another piece of land. And so it's arrogant, I think, of Labor to assume that they know best what Ngāti Paua want, and that they themselves should be making decisions about Ngāti Paua's aspirations for this piece of land. And this is an historic situation where, for the first time in this Parliament, Labor will not be supporting what is effectively a treaty situation. I want to talk to the Minister's SOP, where the Minister has actually gone to some considerable lengths to listen to the submitters who submitted at the very good and thorough Select Committee process, and his SOP is aimed and directed exactly at addressing many of the issues that were raised by those submitters. And so there will be, as a result of the Minister's SOP, a guarantee that Auckland City will cease grazing, and the SOP of the Ministers makes sure that that will occur. The second thing that the Minister's SOP seeks to achieve is that it requires that the area of playing fields be retained. Now, that's exactly what submitters wanted, and the Minister's SOP gives an absolute assurance that 8.4 hectares of playing fields will be retained, and it provides certainty for that community. So this bill has had the total support of Ngāti Paua, and I think that some members across the House seem to have forgotten that. Now, Sir, there were a number of contributions from members. Penny Henare, for instance, asked about the right not to object. Well, Sir, this bill has been part of a very full and appropriate normal Select Committee process. There were hearings held in Auckland, and there have been submissions that have been available, and it was well submitted too by members of the public. And so, Mr Chair, it's seems that Labor have been happy to rely on the same process in some pieces of legislation, Mr Chair, but not in others. And it's this selective picking of sometimes supporting an open and full select committee process and sometimes not that allows them to be, I think, somewhat conflicted in this sort of this kind of legislation. Sir, Dennis O'Rourke from New Zealand First made a very typical New Zealand First kind of speech and a contribution to this debate. I don't think that it added anything to the debate at all. He spoke about the conservation values, but on the other hand, he would much prefer to have cows grazing on this piece of land, and so too it seems that members of the Labor Party would. He said that he wanted to support the community. So I guess that what that means actually is that really deep down New Zealand First do want to support this bill. Eugenie Sage made a point about what guarantee was there that there would be a notified consent process. Well, that is a matter that Auckland City will address. I can't speak on behalf of Auckland City, but I do think that they probably will take on board. I understand that the Mayor has written a letter to the Minister, Nick Smith, and Auckland Council will, I'm sure, take on board the issues raised by Eugenie Sage. So the Minister, I think, has addressed most of the issues that have been raised by submitters in his very good SOP. Michael Wood gave an interesting contribution because here is a relatively new member to this House who barnstormed his way through the Mount Roskill by-election saying that housing was the most important issue. And now suddenly he comes to the Parliament and he finds that under the whip of the Labor caucus that actually suddenly housing isn't the important issue for Auckland after all. Housing isn't the issue that he came to Parliament to support, and suddenly now he wants to support cows rather than houses. And so, Mr Chair, I think that as we've heard from a number of speakers in the debate, Louisa Wall has been the one that has most coherently and articulately really summed up the conflicted and difficult spot that the Labor Party find themselves in this. And so Louisa Wall has really tried to find as much justification as the Labor Party could for not supporting this bill. And she acknowledged that she found it difficult and that that was a difficult situation for the Labor Party to struggle with this piece of legislation. And, sir, I think that that just typifies the internal wrangles and difficult philosophical positions that the Labor Party find themselves in. So I've been interested in listening to these speeches, Mr Chair, and I guess we'll listen to a few more yet to go.
Phil Twyford. I've just called Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I'm not going to waste